Maria Esperanza Rodriguez stared at the official-looking envelope with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she read the Department of Homeland Security letterhead. The kitchen where she had spent countless hours perfecting recipes for her small catering business suddenly felt cold and foreign. Where are you watching this from today? Drop a comment and let me know your state or country, because this story about fighting back against those who try to control us through fear hits differently, depending on where you call home. The letter demanded her immediate appearance for a deportation hearing, claiming her work visa had expired and her marriage documentation was fraudulent. Ricardo Vega, her husband of 8 years, stood behind her reading over her shoulder with what she initially mistook for concern until she heard the satisfaction in his voice. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Maria," he said, his tone carrying none of the sympathy a loving spouse should offer. "Your paperwork was never legitimate. I tried to protect you, but now look what has happened." Maria's hands shook as she reread the official stamps and seals that looked authentic enough to fool anyone. She had been so careful with her documentation, keeping everything organized in the small office space above their garage where she managed her catering orders. The business had grown from preparing meals for church functions to handling corporate events across 3 counties, but Ricardo had always insisted she was living on borrowed time. "You need to sign this over to me immediately," Ricardo continued, producing a stack of papers he had clearly prepared in advance. "The business, the accounts, everything needs to be in an American citizen's name. It is the only way to protect what we have built together." The way he emphasized the word together made Maria's stomach clench. She had started Sabores de Casa with money saved from her previous job as a restaurant manager, money she had earned before their marriage when she was working legally on her H-1B visa. Every recipe was hers, every client relationship built through her own skill and dedication. Yet Ricardo spoke as if he had been an equal partner rather than someone who complained whenever the smell of cooking spices lingered in their home. Maria thought back to their wedding day 5 years earlier, remembering how different Ricardo had seemed then. He had promised to help her navigate the citizenship process, had spoken eloquently about building a life together in America. His family had welcomed her warmly at first, praising her cooking and calling her a blessing to their son. But that warmth had gradually cooled as Ricardo's true nature emerged. The comments started small. His mother would mention how lucky Maria was to have found such a generous American man willing to overlook her situation. His sister would joke about Maria probably missing the poverty she left behind in Colombia. Never mind that Maria had left a comfortable middle-class life and a promising career. Ricardo himself began making offhand remarks about people who took advantage of American generosity, always with a meaningful glance in her direction. Now, as Maria stared at the deportation letter, she realized how systematically Ricardo had been undermining her confidence. He had convinced her to let him handle their tax filings, claiming his accountant could get them better deductions. He had insisted on being the one to communicate with government offices, saying his English was more professional. Most importantly, he had gradually taken control of their finances, arguing that having everything in one account would be simpler for a family. "I cannot sign this," Maria said quietly, her accent thick with emotion. "This business is my life, Ricardo. You know how hard I have worked." Ricardo's face hardened in a way that had become frighteningly familiar over the past few years. "Hard work means nothing if you are not here legally," he replied. "Do you want our daughter to watch her mother get arrested? Do you want Sophia to grow up knowing her mother was a criminal who took advantage of this country's kindness?" The mention of their 7-year-old daughter hit exactly as Ricardo intended. Sophia was everything to Maria, a bright and curious child who spoke English with the confidence of a native speaker, but still loved hearing bedtime stories in Spanish. The thought of being separated from Sophia made Maria's chest tighten with panic. "I just need time to think," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming of the refrigerator that stored ingredients for tomorrow's catering order. "Time is what you do not have," Ricardo snapped, snatching the deportation letter from her hands. "This says you have 72 hours to report. That means you have 72 hours to get your affairs in order and prepare for the inevitable. Unless you want to make this even harder on everyone involved." As he stormed out of the kitchen, Maria sank into one of the chairs surrounding the small table where she planned menus and calculated costs for her events. The same table where she had taught Sophia to write her name in both English and Spanish, where she had celebrated every business milestone with quiet pride. The walls around her displayed framed photographs of elaborate wedding cakes she had created, corporate lunch spreads that had earned rave reviews, and quinceañera celebrations that had brought tears of joy to grateful families. Everything she had built felt like it was crumbling around her, yet somewhere deep inside, a small voice reminded her that she had survived challenges before. She had left everything familiar in Bogotá to pursue opportunities in a new country. She had learned American business practices while maintaining the authenticity that made her food special. She had raised a confident, bilingual daughter despite Ricardo's increasing hostility toward her heritage. Looking at the deportation letter again, Maria noticed something that had escaped her attention during the initial panic. The address listed for her was incorrect, showing an apartment number that did not exist at their current home. The agent's name was also spelled differently across different sections of the document. Small inconsistencies that might mean nothing or might mean everything. For the first time since opening that envelope, Maria allowed herself to wonder if Ricardo's convenient timing and detailed preparation might indicate something more sinister than just an unfortunate coincidence. 3 days after the deportation letter arrived, Ricardo announced that his colleague from the law firm would be joining them for dinner. "He wants to help us understand your options," Ricardo explained with the false concern that had become his specialty. "Thomas has handled many immigration cases and knows exactly what people in your situation are dealing with." Maria spent the afternoon preparing her grandmother's signature dish, arroz con pollo, along with fresh arepas and a delicate tres leches cake that had become her most requested dessert for special occasions. The familiar rhythm of chopping, seasoning, and stirring provided some comfort as her mind raced with questions about the meeting ahead. When Thomas Brennan arrived, his expensive suit and cold handshake immediately put Maria on edge. He surveyed their modest home with the calculating gaze of someone cataloging assets, his eyes lingering on the professional-grade mixer and commercial food processor that Ricardo had reluctantly purchased when Maria's business began generating serious income. "This smells incredible," Thomas said as they gathered around the dining table. "Ricardo, you never mentioned your wife was such a talented cook. Where did you learn to prepare food like this, Maria?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Maria caught the subtle emphasis on the word learn, as if her skills were somehow suspect or unearned. "I have been cooking since I was very young," she replied carefully. "My grandmother taught me traditional recipes, and I studied culinary arts at Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá before coming to America." Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance with Ricardo before responding. "Bogotá, yes. We see many people claiming educational credentials from South American institutions. The verification process for those degrees can be quite complicated, especially when someone's legal status is questionable." Maria felt her cheeks flush but maintained her composure as she served generous portions of the arroz con pollo. She had graduated summa cum laude from one of Colombia's most prestigious universities, a fact that Ricardo conveniently omitted when introducing her to his friends and colleagues. Instead, he preferred the narrative of having rescued a struggling immigrant woman from an uncertain future. As the meal progressed, Thomas began what seemed like casual conversation about Maria's catering business. "How long have you been running this little cooking operation?" he asked between bites. "And I assume Ricardo handles all the legal and financial aspects for you?" "Actually, I manage most of those details myself," Maria responded, serving him a second helping of the tres leches cake he had been praising enthusiastically. "I handle client contracts, vendor relationships, tax documentation, and business planning. My English may carry an accent, but my business skills are quite comprehensive." Ricardo's fork clattered against his plate as he shot her a warning look. "Maria is being modest," he interjected quickly. "I handle all the serious paperwork and regulatory compliance. She focuses on the cooking, which is really what she does best." Thomas nodded approvingly at Ricardo's correction while addressing Maria directly. "That makes sense. These regulatory requirements can be overwhelming for someone without proper legal training. Speaking of which, Ricardo mentioned you might be having some documentation issues that need immediate attention." The conversation continued in this vein throughout dinner, with Thomas making increasingly pointed comments about people who overstayed visas, married for citizenship, or operated businesses without proper authorization. Each veiled accusation was delivered with a smile and followed by compliments about the food, creating a disorienting atmosphere of simultaneous praise and threat. When Thomas excused himself to take a phone call, Maria began clearing dishes while listening to Ricardo's animated conversation in the living room. They were discussing her case as if she were not in the next room, with Ricardo explaining how cooperative she had been and how eager she was to resolve her status issues properly. As Maria loaded the dishwasher, her phone buzzed with a text message in Spanish from her longtime friend Carmen, who worked as a paralegal at an immigration law firm downtown. The message was brief, but loaded with meaning. La documentación que pediste esta lista. Todo está en orden como pensábamos. Maria quickly deleted the message and returned to the dining room just as Thomas was concluding his call. She refilled their coffee cups while Thomas continued his assessment of her situation, his tone becoming more direct as the evening progressed. People in situations like yours often make the mistake of trying to maintain too much independence, he explained, stirring cream into his coffee with deliberate slowness. The reality is that deportation proceedings move very quickly once they begin. Your best protection is having an American citizen vouching for your character and taking responsibility for your obligations. Ricardo leaned forward eagerly, clearly anticipating this moment, which is why Maria needs to transfer her business assets to me immediately. It protects both of us if immigration authorities decide to freeze her accounts or question the legitimacy of her income. Thomas nodded sagely while addressing Maria directly. Your husband is absolutely correct. I have seen too many cases where delay leads to complete asset forfeiture. The government tends to assume that undocumented individuals acquired property through questionable means. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot, but her voice remained steady. I understand your concern, but I would prefer to review any legal documents with my own representation before making such significant changes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as both men stared at her with undisguised annoyance. Thomas recovered first, his practiced smile returning as he delivered what sounded like a casual observation but felt like a direct threat. Of course, that is your right, he said slowly. Although I should mention that my firm has excellent relationships with ICE enforcement officers in this district. We often coordinate on cases involving document fraud and business irregularities. Sometimes advance warning about cooperative individuals can make all the difference in how aggressively they pursue enforcement actions. After Thomas left, Ricardo's facade of concerned husband evaporated completely. He cornered Maria in the kitchen where she was finishing the last of the dinner cleanup, his face flushed with anger and what might have been panic. You embarrassed me tonight, he hissed, grabbing her wrist hard enough to leave marks. Thomas was trying to help you, and you acted like some kind of expert who knows better than trained legal professionals. Maria pulled her arm free and faced him directly, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I embarrassed you by demonstrating that I am capable of understanding my own business and legal affairs? Or did I embarrass you by showing your friend that I am not the helpless victim you have been describing? Ricardo's expression grew dangerous in a way that made Maria instinctively step backward toward the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Do not push me, Maria. I have been patient with your attitude, but my patience has limits. Thomas was not making suggestions tonight. Those were instructions. He moved closer, backing her against the counter where she had spent so many hours creating meals that brought joy to others. Tomorrow morning you will go to the bank and add my name to every business account. Tomorrow afternoon, you will sign the papers transferring ownership of Sabores de Casa to me. And tomorrow evening you will call every client to inform them that Ricardo Vega is now the owner and operator of this business. Just then, Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing her favorite purple pajamas and clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since toddlerhood. Daddy, why are you yelling at Mommy? She asked, her 7-year-old voice carrying the kind of confusion that breaks a mother's heart. Ricardo's demeanor shifted instantly back to the charming father role he played when others were watching. We were just discussing some boring grown-up business, princess. Nothing for you to worry about. But Sophia's dark eyes, so much like Maria's own, remained focused on her mother's face. Mommy looked scared, she observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. Are you scared, Mommy? Maria knelt down to Sophia's eye level. Forcing a smile, she did not feel while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. I am just tired, mi amor. Sometimes adults have complicated conversations that sound scarier than they really are. As she tucked Sophia back into bed and read 3 chapters from their current bedtime story, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Whatever Ricardo and his lawyer friend were planning, whatever threats they thought would control her, they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed she was as helpless and isolated as Ricardo had spent years trying to make her believe. The knock on the door came at exactly 9:15 on Thursday morning, sharp and official in a way that made Ricardo freeze mid-bite of the breakfast Maria had prepared. Through the front window, Maria could see a government sedan parked in their driveway, and a man in a dark suit checking documents on a clipboard. "This is it," Ricardo whispered, his face draining of color. They came sooner than Thomas expected. "Maria, go upstairs and pack a bag. Take only essential documents, and do not try to contact anyone." Maria's heart raced as she approached the front door, but something about the agent's professional demeanor seemed different from what she had been expecting. When she opened the door, the man displayed his credentials with practiced efficiency. "Agent David Chun, Immigration and Customs Enforcement," he said clearly. "I am looking for Ricardo Vega regarding outstanding compliance issues with his tax filings and business reporting obligations." The relief that flooded through Maria was immediately followed by confusion as she processed what the agent had actually said. "You are looking for my husband, not for me?" Agent Chun consulted his paperwork before responding. "No, ma'am. I am here specifically to discuss discrepancies in Mr. Vega's reported income and business holdings." "Are you Ms. Rodriguez?" The way he pronounced her name, with careful respect for the Spanish pronunciation, struck Maria as significant. "Yes, I am Maria Esperanza Rodriguez." "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand you operate Sabores de Casa catering services. We need to verify some information about business licenses and tax documentation that your husband has been claiming on his federal returns." Ricardo appeared behind Maria, his earlier panic now mixed with obvious confusion. "Officer, I think there has been some mistake. My wife is the one with immigration problems, not me. We have been expecting someone to come about her deportation proceedings." Agent Chin's expression remained neutral as he reviewed his files again. "Sir, I am not here about any deportation proceedings. I am investigating potential tax fraud and false business ownership claims. Mr. Vega, according to your recent tax filings, you have claimed ownership and operational control of a catering business generating over $200,000 annually in revenue." Maria felt something shift inside her chest as she listened to the agent describe her business's actual financial success. Ricardo had been telling her for months that the business was barely breaking even, that they needed to be careful about expenses and modest in their expectations. "That is correct," Ricardo said with forced confidence. "I have been managing all aspects of the business operations and financial planning." Agent Chin turned to Maria with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "Ms. Rodriguez, do you have documentation showing business licenses, operational permits, and tax filings for Sabores de Casa?" Without hesitation, Maria nodded toward the stairs. "The documentation is in my office upstairs. Would you like me to retrieve it?" As they climbed to the small office space above the garage, Maria felt Ricardo's nervous energy radiating behind her. She had always kept her most important documents in a fireproof safe that Ricardo assumed contained only sentimental items and old photographs. The combination was Sophia's birth date, something she had never shared with her husband. Opening the safe, Maria withdrew a thick folder containing business incorporation papers, commercial kitchen licenses, food service permits, and 3 years of detailed tax returns filed under Rodriguez Catering Services, LLC. Agent Chun examined each document carefully while Ricardo grew increasingly pale. "Ms. Rodriguez, these documents show that you incorporated this business under your maiden name 3 years ago and have been filing taxes as a sole proprietorship with the IRS and State Revenue Department. Your business license and food service permits are all current and properly maintained." Maria handed over additional documentation, including her employer identification number paperwork and commercial liability insurance policies. "Everything has been properly registered and maintained since I started the business. I handle all regulatory compliance and customer relationships directly." Agent Chin's expression grew more serious as he compared Maria's legitimate documentation with whatever information he had about Ricardo's tax claims. Mr. Vega, can you explain why you have been reporting this business income on your personal tax returns when you are not listed as an owner, operator, or employee of Rodriguez Catering Services? The question hung in the air as Ricardo struggled to formulate a response that would not incriminate him further. Maria watched her husband's face cycle through various emotions before settling on desperate anger. "This is my home, and Maria is my wife," Ricardo finally said. Community property laws mean that her business income is considered marital income for tax purposes. Agent Chun consulted his notes again before addressing Maria directly. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need to clarify your citizenship status for our records. The business documentation shows you as a United States citizen, but Mr. Vega's statements to our office suggested otherwise." Maria felt a calm certainty wash over her as she reached back into the safe and withdrew a blue folder she had not opened in months. "My naturalization ceremony was completed 3 years ago, on September 15th. I have maintained dual citizenship with Colombia as permitted under current immigration law." She handed Agent Chun her naturalization certificate, her current United States passport, and documentation from the ceremony, where she had taken the oath of citizenship. Ricardo stared at these documents as if they were written in a foreign language he could not comprehend. "But the deportation letter," Ricardo stammered. "The ICE investigation into her status." Thomas said the authorities were already building a case. Agent Chin looked genuinely puzzled as he continued reviewing Maria's citizenship documentation. "Sir, there are no deportation proceedings involving Ms. Rodriguez in our system. As a naturalized citizen in good standing, she would not be subject to removal proceedings unless she had committed serious federal crimes, which our background check shows no evidence of." The silence that followed was broken by Ricardo's phone ringing loudly in his pocket. He glanced at the caller ID, and his face went completely white as he declined the call. Agent Chin gathered Maria's documents into a neat stack and handed them back to her with something approaching respect. "Ms. Rodriguez, your business and citizenship documentation appears to be completely in order. Mr. Vega, I will need you to accompany me to our office for further discussion about the discrepancies in your tax filings." As they prepared to leave, Agent Chun turned back to Maria with what seemed like genuine concern. "Ms. Rodriguez, if someone has been making false claims about your immigration status or threatening you with deportation proceedings, that could constitute a serious federal crime. I would encourage you to contact our fraud reporting hotline if you have experienced this type of intimidation." After the government sedan pulled out of their driveway with Ricardo in the passenger seat, Maria sat in her kitchen holding her citizenship documentation and feeling like she was seeing her own life clearly for the first time in years. The deportation letter that had terrified her was nowhere to be found, and she was beginning to understand that Ricardo's control over her had been built on lies that were finally collapsing. 2 hours after Ricardo left with Agent Chun, a sleek silver BMW pulled into Maria's driveway. The woman who emerged wore an impeccably tailored navy suit and carried a leather briefcase that spoke of serious legal expertise. Maria recognized her immediately from their phone conversations, though they had never met in person. Elena Vasquez had been recommended by Carmen 3 months earlier when Maria first began suspecting that Ricardo's financial control over their household was not as legitimate as he claimed. Elena specialized in immigration law and business protection for naturalized citizens, particularly women facing domestic financial abuse. "Maria," Elena said warmly as she extended her hand, "it is wonderful to finally meet you in person. I brought everything we discussed, plus some additional documentation that I think you will find very illuminating." They settled at Maria's kitchen table, the same space where Thomas Brennan had delivered his veiled threats just days earlier. The contrast between the two legal consultations could not have been more stark. Where Thomas had projected intimidation and control, Elena radiated competence and advocacy. "First," Elena said, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency, "let us review your actual legal status so there is no confusion about your rights and protections." She produced a thick folder containing Maria's complete immigration history, from her initial H-1B work visa through her permanent residence application to her naturalization ceremony. "Your pathway to citizenship was exemplary," Elena explained, pointing to specific documents. Advanced degree from a prestigious Colombian university, specialized skills in hospitality management, employer sponsorship from Meridian Hotels where you worked as assistant food service director. Your permanent residence was approved without any complications, and you qualified for naturalization a full year early due to your marriage to a U.S. citizen. Maria studied the timeline that Elena had prepared, seeing her own journey mapped out with official clarity. I never understood why Ricardo kept insisting my status was uncertain. Every time I asked to see our joint immigration filings, he said the lawyers were handling everything and I should not worry about technical details. Elena's expression grew serious as she produced another set of documents. That brings us to the business incorporation papers for Rodriguez Catering Services. Maria, when you filed these documents 3 years ago, did Ricardo assist with the paperwork or legal consultation? The question brought back memories that Maria had almost forgotten. She had incorporated the business during a week when Ricardo was traveling for work, using legal assistance from a small business development center that offered services in Spanish. The entire process had been surprisingly straightforward once she found advocates who treated her expertise with respect. No, Maria replied slowly. Ricardo was not involved in the incorporation at all. He was annoyed that I spent money on legal fees without consulting him first. He said I was being overly dramatic about formalizing something that was just a hobby. Elena smiled with satisfaction as she opened a new section of her briefcase. Then you will be very interested in these bank records and financial reports that I obtained through your business account authorizations. The documents Elena spread across the table revealed the true scope and success of Sabores de Casa in precise financial detail. 3 business checking accounts, 1 savings account designated for equipment purchases, and a money market account for tax reserves. The combined balance exceeded $150,000, with monthly revenue consistently above $20,000 for the past 18 months. Maria stared at the numbers with growing amazement. I knew the business was doing well, but Ricardo always handled our household budget and told me we needed to be very careful about expenses. He said my catering income was barely covering the costs of ingredients and equipment. Elena pointed to specific line items showing equipment purchases, commercial kitchen lease payments, and employee wages for the part-time staff that Maria had hired to help with larger events. Your business has been operating at a significant profit margin and maintaining excellent cash flow. These are the financial statements of a successful enterprise, not a hobby or break-even venture. The next revelation came when Elena produced Maria's federal and state tax returns for the previous 3 years, documents that Ricardo had insisted on handling through his own accountant. Reviewing her actual filings, Maria discovered that she had been paying quarterly estimated taxes as a business owner and maintaining meticulous records of all deductible expenses. You have been completely compliant with all tax obligations, Elena explained. Your business license fees are current. Your commercial liability insurance is paid through next year, and your food service permits have been renewed promptly every cycle. From a legal standpoint, Rodriguez Catering Services is a model small business operation. Elena paused to let Maria absorb this information before moving to the most significant documents in her briefcase. Now, about the property and asset ownership that Ricardo has been claiming. She produced title documents and property records that painted a very different picture of their financial reality. The house you live in has been jointly owned since your marriage, with both names on the mortgage and deed. However, the commercial kitchen space you lease for larger events is registered solely under Rodriguez Catering Services, as are the commercial-grade appliances and equipment purchased for business use. Maria felt a strange mixture of pride and anger as Elena continued reviewing asset documentation. Pride in her own accomplishments and business acumen. Anger at how systematically Ricardo had undermined her understanding of their financial situation. The most shocking revelation came when Elena produced a copy of the current month's Forbes magazine, open to an article about emerging entrepreneurs in the Hispanic business community. There, in a sidebar featuring rising stars in the catering and hospitality industry, was a photograph of Maria standing in her commercial kitchen alongside a brief profile of Sabores de Casa. The article described Maria as an innovative businesswoman who had built a successful catering company by combining traditional Colombian recipes with contemporary presentation styles. It mentioned her plans to expand into a second location and her involvement with a nonprofit organization that provided business mentorship to other immigrant women. I had forgotten about the interview, Maria said softly, remembering the journalist who had contacted her several months earlier. Ricardo was traveling that week, and I thought it was just a small local publication. Elena smiled as she pointed to the magazine's circulation numbers printed in small text at the bottom of the page. Forbes has a readership of over 6 million people, Maria. This level of recognition represents significant credibility and business validation. As their meeting concluded, Elena handed Maria a summary document outlining her legal rights as both a naturalized citizen and a business owner. At the bottom of the summary was a phone number for reporting immigration fraud and a second number for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Maria, Elena said with the kind of direct honesty that had become rare in Maria's life, everything Ricardo has told you about your legal vulnerability has been completely false. You are a successful businesswoman, a United States citizen in excellent standing, and the victim of what appears to be systematic financial and psychological abuse. After Elena left, Maria sat alone in her kitchen surrounded by documents that told the true story of her life in America. The woman described in these official papers bore little resemblance to the helpless illegal immigrant that Ricardo had convinced her she was. For the first time in years, Maria felt the return of something she had almost forgotten existed: confidence in her own judgment and trust in her ability to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. By Friday morning, Ricardo's carefully constructed world was unraveling faster than he could contain the damage. Maria was preparing Sophia's breakfast when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling into their driveway. Through the kitchen window, she watched as 3 official cars arrived in sequence: an IRS enforcement vehicle, a sedan from Ricardo's law firm, and a white van that she did not immediately recognize. The first visitor was Auditor Patricia Chun, Agent Chin's colleague from the Internal Revenue Service. She carried a briefcase full of documentation and wore the expression of someone who had spent considerable time reviewing fraudulent tax filings. Ms. Rodriguez, Auditor Chun said after presenting her credentials, I need to discuss some serious discrepancies we have discovered in tax returns filed under your husband's Social Security number. Specifically, he has been claiming business income and deductions for a company that our records show is owned and operated entirely by you. Maria invited Auditor Chun to sit at the kitchen table while Sophia finished her cereal and gathered her school supplies. The normalcy of the morning routine felt surreal against the backdrop of a federal investigation, but Maria found herself strangely calm as she answered detailed questions about her business operations. Over the past 3 years, Auditor Chun explained while reviewing her files, Mr. Vega has claimed over $400,000 in business revenue on his personal tax returns. He has also taken substantial deductions for business equipment, commercial kitchen lease payments, and employee wages. However, none of these claims correspond to any legitimate business registered under his name. Maria provided copies of her own tax filings, business registration documents, and bank records that painted a complete picture of Rodriguez Catering Services' legitimate operations. As Auditor Chun compared the 2 sets of documentation, her expression grew increasingly serious. Ms. Rodriguez, your husband has been committing systematic tax fraud by claiming your business income as his own while you have been properly filing and paying taxes on the same revenue stream. This represents both identity theft and deliberate fraud against the federal government. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call that made Ricardo's situation dramatically worse. His law firm partner, Jonathan Mills, was calling to inform Maria that Ricardo had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into false credentials on his employment application and bar certification documents. Auditor Chun listened with obvious interest as Maria took the call on speakerphone. Apparently, Ricardo's claims about his educational background and legal training contained significant fabrications that had come to light during the federal investigation into his financial activities. After Sophia left for school with her usual kiss and hug for Mama, Maria's attention was drawn to activity on the street. Several of her regular catering employees had arrived at the same time, clearly coordinated and carrying what appeared to be a large bouquet of flowers and a professionally printed banner. Carmen Delgado knocked on the front door with characteristic confidence, followed by 3 other women who had become essential members of Maria's catering team. Carmen worked as sous chef for larger events, while Rosa handled client coordination and Anna managed setup and service for corporate functions. Maria, Carmen said with fierce loyalty evident in her voice, "We heard about what Ricardo has been doing to you and wanted you to know that we stand behind you completely. We have prepared statements for the authorities about his lies and the way he has been stealing credit for your work." The banner they displayed read, "Sabores de Casa," built by Maria, supported by community, in both English and Spanish. More importantly, Carmen handed Maria a folder containing signed affidavits from dozens of clients who had specifically requested Maria's services and had no idea that Ricardo was claiming ownership of the business. Rosa stepped forward with additional documentation that made Ricardo's situation even more precarious. "Maria," she said quietly, "you should know that Ricardo approached several of our major clients last month trying to renegotiate contracts under his own name. Most of them called me directly because they were confused about why someone else was claiming to represent Sabores de Casa." The evidence that Maria's employees provided painted a picture of Ricardo desperately attempting to hijack her business relationships while systematically undermining her confidence in her own capabilities. Client testimonials praised Maria's creativity, professionalism, and personal attention to detail while expressing confusion about Ricardo's sudden appearance in business communications. The morning's revelations grew more serious when Auditor Chun received a call from her supervisor about additional fraudulent activities. Ricardo had apparently applied for several business loans using Sabores de Casa as collateral, forging Maria's signature on documents that pledged her equipment and commercial kitchen lease as security for debts she knew nothing about. "Ms. Rodriguez," Auditor Chun said after ending her call, "we have discovered that your husband has obtained over $75,000 in fraudulent loans using your business assets as collateral. The banks involved have been notified, and criminal charges are being prepared for identity theft and wire fraud." The cascade of consequences accelerated throughout the day as more institutions became aware of Ricardo's fraudulent activities. His mother called Maria in tears, explaining that she had received legal notices about a fraudulent mortgage application that Ricardo had submitted using her property as collateral without her knowledge or consent. His sister Elena called next, her voice sharp with anger as she described receiving notification from her bank about suspicious activity on a business credit line that Ricardo had opened using forged documents claiming partnership in a successful catering company. The most devastating call came from Ricardo's employer, who had discovered that his law school transcripts were completely fabricated and that he had never actually passed the bar examination in any state. His entire legal career had been built on fraudulent credentials that were finally being exposed under federal scrutiny. As afternoon approached, Maria received an unexpected visit from Child Protective Services. The social worker, Margaret Torres, had been contacted by Sophia's school counselor after Sophia mentioned that Daddy had been yelling at Mommy about police and going away. "Ms. Rodriguez," Margaret said with professional concern, "we need to discuss the impact that domestic financial abuse may be having on your daughter's well-being. Several people have reported that your husband has been using immigration threats and deportation fears to control and intimidate you in front of Sophia." Maria found herself explaining to a government social worker how Ricardo had systematically undermined her understanding of her own legal status and business success while using their daughter as emotional leverage. Margaret listened with growing concern as Maria described the fake deportation letter and Ricardo's threats to have her arrested if she did not sign over her business. The documentation that Margaret reviewed told a clear story of psychological abuse designed to maintain control through manufactured fear and false legal threats. Most concerning to the social worker was evidence that Ricardo had been teaching Sophia to view her mother as illegitimate and vulnerable rather than as a successful businesswoman and United States citizen. By evening, when Ricardo finally returned home accompanied by his own legal counsel, he found Maria sitting calmly at their kitchen table surrounded by federal documentation, employee affidavits, client testimonials, and social services reports that painted a complete picture of his fraudulent activities and abusive behavior. The man who walked through their front door bore little resemblance to the confident controller who had threatened Maria with deportation just days earlier. Ricardo looked exhausted, defeated, and desperate as he realized that every lie he had constructed was being systematically exposed by the very institutions he had claimed were targeting Maria. For the first time in their marriage, Ricardo found himself in the position of needing Maria's mercy and cooperation, while she held all the legal and financial power to determine his future. Monday morning arrived with the sharp knock of federal law enforcement at 7:30 precisely. Maria had been expecting this moment since Friday's revelations, and she opened the door to find two United States Marshals holding an arrest warrant with Ricardo's name prominently displayed in official typeface. Marshal Janet Rodriguez presented her credentials with professional courtesy before explaining the charges. Mr. Ricardo Vega, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit tax fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, and filing false statements with federal agencies. The combined charges carry potential sentences exceeding 20 years in federal prison. Ricardo emerged from the kitchen where he had been sitting in silence since the previous evening's confrontations. His expensive suit from the dinner with Thomas Brennan had been replaced by rumpled clothing that reflected his rapidly deteriorating circumstances. The confident controller who had threatened Maria with deportation was gone, replaced by a man who could barely make eye contact as the marshals read his rights. As Ricardo was led to the official vehicle, Sophia watched from the living room window with the confused expression of a child trying to understand why Daddy was leaving with police officers. Maria knelt beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully as she explained that Daddy had made some serious mistakes that required him to go away for a while. Within 2 hours of Ricardo's arrest, Maria's phone began ringing with calls from journalists who had been following the story through law enforcement sources. The combination of immigration fraud, business identity theft, and domestic financial abuse had created exactly the kind of compelling narrative that resonated with both English and Spanish-language media outlets. Reporter Linda Chong from Channel 7 News arrived first, accompanied by a camera crew and a producer who had been covering stories about financial abuse in immigrant communities. Linda's questions were respectful but thorough as she sought to understand how Ricardo had maintained his deception for so many years. The story that emerged during the interview revealed the sophisticated nature of Ricardo's manipulation tactics. He had isolated Maria from legal resources by convincing her that her accent and foreign birth made her vulnerable to discrimination from American institutions. He had controlled their household finances by claiming expertise in tax law and business regulation that he did not actually possess. Most insidiously, he had used their daughter as emotional leverage while teaching Sophia to view her mother's heritage and capabilities with the same dismissive attitude he displayed. By afternoon, Maria found herself at the county courthouse obtaining an emergency restraining order that prohibited Ricardo from contacting her or Sophia and prevented him from making any claims about Rodriguez catering services or her other business assets. Judge Patricia Morales reviewed the evidence of domestic financial abuse with obvious concern before granting Maria full temporary custody of Sophia and exclusive use of their shared residence. The legal proceedings were covered by multiple news outlets, creating a media narrative that positioned Maria as both victim and victor. Her story resonated particularly strongly with advocacy groups focused on protecting immigrant women from domestic abuse and financial manipulation. By Wednesday, the ripple effects of Ricardo's arrest had spread throughout his extended family and professional network. His mother, Elena Vega, received a visit from FBI agents investigating the fraudulent mortgage application Ricardo had submitted using her property as collateral without authorization. His sister faced criminal charges as an unwitting accomplice after investigators discovered that Ricardo had used her identity to open business credit lines. Thomas Brennan, the lawyer who had threatened Maria during their dinner meeting, found himself under investigation by the State Bar Association for ethics violations after Agent Chen discovered that Thomas had been helping Ricardo prepare fraudulent immigration documents designed to intimidate Maria into surrendering her business assets. The law firm where Ricardo had worked for 3 years faced severe sanctions when investigators discovered that partners had failed to properly verify his credentials despite multiple red flags about his educational background and bar certification. Several major clients terminated their relationships with the firm after learning that they had been represented by someone who was not actually licensed to practice law. The media attention surrounding Maria's story created an unexpected surge in business for Sabores de Casa, as customers throughout the region sought to support a woman who had overcome such systematic abuse and deception. Her phone rang constantly with inquiries about catering services, and several upscale hotels contacted her about providing regular meal services for their conference facilities. Local business leaders reached out to offer support and collaboration opportunities that Ricardo had prevented Maria from pursuing during their marriage. The Hispanic Chamber of Commerce invited her to speak at their monthly meeting about entrepreneurship and resilience. 3 different banks competed to offer her expanded business credit lines now that her true financial picture was clear. Most significantly, Carmen contacted Maria with news that would transform her business completely. A group of successful Latina businesswomen had been following Maria's story and wanted to invest in expanding Sabores de Casa into a full-service restaurant with multiple locations throughout the state. The investment proposal included funding for a flagship restaurant location, commercial kitchen expansion, and a nonprofit component focused on providing business training and legal resources for other immigrant women facing similar abuse. Maria would maintain majority ownership while gaining access to the capital and expertise needed to build something far beyond what she had imagined possible. 6 months after Ricardo's arrest, Maria stood before a congressional subcommittee examining domestic financial abuse in immigrant communities. She wore the same navy blue suit that had represented professionalism and confidence during her meeting with Elena Vasquez, but now she carried herself with the authority of someone whose expertise was recognized at the highest levels of government. Her testimony described the systematic nature of immigration-based financial abuse and the urgent need for better legal protections for naturalized citizens facing domestic manipulation. She spoke fluently in both English and Spanish as she addressed representatives about policy changes that could prevent other women from experiencing the isolation and control she had endured. The hearing room was filled with advocates, journalists, and other survivors who had been inspired by Maria's transformation from victim to advocate. Sophia, now 8 years old and thriving in her mother's confident household, watched from the gallery with obvious pride as her mother addressed some of the most powerful people in the country. During the lunch break, Maria received a call from Elena Vasquez with news about Ricardo's sentencing hearing. He had been convicted on all charges and faced 15 years in federal prison, followed by deportation to Colombia upon completion of his sentence. The judge had been particularly harsh in condemning Ricardo's use of immigration fears to control and abuse a naturalized citizen who had contributed significantly to her community. More importantly, the court had ordered Ricardo to pay full restitution to Maria for the business income he had fraudulently claimed, the loans he had obtained using her assets as collateral, and the legal expenses she had incurred defending herself against his systematic abuse. The restitution order exceeded $300,000 and included garnishment of any future income Ricardo might earn. That evening, Maria returned to the restaurant location where Sabores de Casa had expanded under her new business partnership. The space buzzed with activity as her team prepared for a sold-out evening of diners who had come to experience the authentic Colombian cuisine that had earned recognition throughout the region. As she walked through the kitchen where Sofia was doing homework at a small table while employees worked around her, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once trembled over a fake deportation letter now employed 15 people, owned 2 restaurant locations, and had been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine as Business Owner of the Year. The evening's final surprise came when Elena Vasquez arrived with a special guest. Judge Patricia Morales, who had granted Maria's restraining order months earlier, had asked to meet personally with the woman whose case had inspired new judicial training programs about recognizing domestic financial abuse. Judge Morales explained that Maria's case had become a landmark example used in legal education to help attorneys and judges identify the warning signs of immigration-based psychological abuse. Law schools throughout the country were teaching Maria's story as part of their domestic violence and immigration law curricula. As the evening wound down and Maria prepared to close the restaurant, she stood in her office looking at the wall where she had hung her naturalization certificate, her business licenses, and photographs from the congressional hearing where she had testified. On the desk sat a letter from the White House inviting her to participate in a task force on immigrant entrepreneurship and a contract for a cookbook deal that would share her recipes and her story with readers nationwide. Sophia appeared in the doorway carrying her completed homework and the stuffed rabbit that remained her constant companion. "Mommy," she said with the straightforward curiosity of childhood, "are you famous now?" Maria laughed as she gathered her daughter into her arms, remembering the terrified woman who had once believed that her husband held the power to have her deported from the country where she had built a successful business and raised a confident daughter. "No, mi amor," Maria replied as she turned off the office lights and prepared to head home to the house that was now truly theirs. "I am not famous. I am just finally free to be exactly who I always was." This story shows us that sometimes the people trying to control us through fear are actually the ones living lies that will eventually be exposed. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who was trying to make you feel smaller than you really are? Share your thoughts in the comments about how this story connected with your own experiences of finding your strength when others tried to diminish it.